Hi, I'm Steven Angowski with Coaxial's aftermarket department, and today I'm going to show you how to do a 30 ACM coaxial bearing assembly. That's part number 681035. Before you start working in the shop, just make sure you've got your safety equipment. If your company requires anything else, just make sure you abide by that. All right, before you get started, just make sure that you check to make sure you've got all the parts needed. Check to make sure you have all the tools required. Some of the tools we'll be using include a set of Allen wrenches. We also have some lock nut spanner tools, just some adjustable wrenches, chisels. I have a set of special tubes here. These are to install the bearings on the shaft. You can make these out of any kind of pipe that will fit the ID of the bearing and slide over the shaft without interfering. We also have a special tool here for installation of the needle bearing outer race and needles into the rotor shaft. If you would like to make one of these for installing yourself, just contact us and we'll help you make one. And I also have a dead blow hammer, and one thing that's not shown here that we'll be using is a hydraulic press. Alternatively, you can heat the bearings as long as you do not surpass 180 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's always a good idea to check with the bearing manufacturer before you go ahead and do that. We're going to start here with the top end cover with this seal here. When you install the seals, it's important to make note of the orientation, as they will only work in one direction. With this seal, we are going to install the seal to keep dirt out, which means from the top you will see the spring. And we're going to use a plastic hammer to protect this seal. All right, what I've done here is taken a metal drift to seat the edge of the seal, make sure that it's completely seated. This seal is going to end up accepting the shaft of the rotor, and it's used to keep the dirt from entering the bearings. Next, we'll move on to the lower end cover and follow the same procedure. Just make sure you note that the position of the end cover is correct, and also the position of the seal. In this case, this seal is also positioned with the spring facing out to keep the material from entering into the bearings. So put it in like so and get it started by tapping. Okay. You can see the seal is seated by checking this gap around the end cover. When you see that it's fully pressed and there are no gaps, you can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to move on to the separator shaft. We'll start by pressing the two upper bearings in place. So for this, we're going to do this in a vise with our special sleeves. Just note that the vise, I'm using some brass grips to protect the shaft to make sure we're not going to put any burrs that might inhibit the bearings from going on. The two upper bearings are the same and the orientation does not matter, so you can mix and match these as you please. You can kind of get a feel for if it's going on straight. And then you can come in with your sleeve. Let's see, this one fits the inner race best. So we'll just tap it gently till we feel it start going. Check to make sure it's passing the threads okay. You also want to make sure that that inner edge there does not damage the threads for the lock nut. All right, that's fully seated. So next comes our spacer that goes in between. This is the spacer set. We've got a spacer for the inner race and for the outer race. So make sure you get those on before you start pushing the next bearing. And we'll use the same procedure for the upper separator bearing. Next step would be the lock nut and lock washer. So first comes your lock nut. Make sure you align the tab with the slot through the threads. You can use your small lock nut spanner to tighten this. Since these bearings are pretty small, it's not too hard to move the bearing itself with the spanner if you didn't seat it all the way. All right, so now that's snug, we'll use a hammer to line up the lock nut with one of the tabs on the lock washer. So we'll give it a couple hits first just to make it snug, and then we'll keep moving it on. The tab on the lock washer is lined up with the lock nut, so I'm going to use my chisel to just tap it into the slot to lock it in place. And that's all it takes. You don't really have to crush it in there, just enough to keep it from unthreading. So I flipped over the separator shaft, and the bearings we installed are now on the bottom here. So we'll go ahead and put the lower needle bearing on. To do that, we're going to remove the outer race from the inner race and set the outer race aside for now. We'll come back to that later. And we're going to use a similar procedure just by putting it onto the shaft. And then we're going to use our sleeve again to press it into place. Cool. That's all set. Next we'll move on to the rotor shaft, but in order to do that we'll need to use a hydraulic press since these bearings are much larger than the separator bearings here. So for the next shot we'll be over at the hydraulic press. So here I am aligning the bearing, then you put it in the press. In this case I have to put some spacers to take up the room. Alternatively, you can just raise your press. Put the safety guard in place and then start pressing until the bearing is fully seated. And when using a hydraulic press, make sure you don't use too much pressure. You'll notice the bearing's fully seated when the needle on your gauge starts to rise. After the first bearing's put on the spacers and then the second bearing. Check for alignment, see if you can get it started. And the same procedure follows for pressing the second bearing. And lastly, there is a sleeve between the second and third bearings. And again, we're using the same procedure of tapping the bearing to get it started, and we'll press it again in the hydraulic press. It's important to make sure you don't damage the threads using this method, so make sure that the shaft is centered on the press. Just removing any dirt until we move to the next step. All right, the next step is to install the outer race of the needle bearing with the needles. Before we do that, we're going to put some grease on the needles to keep them from falling out. And for this, we're just using general purpose grease. And if you require food or farmer grease, you can just contact us and we'll help you select the right kind of grease. Once the needle bearing is greased, we will slide it into the shaft. And now we have our special needle bearing tool to install this. This is made with the inner race of an old needle bearing, so it fits in the bearing, to keep the needles from falling in and to protect the cage. And then we'll take our dead blow hammer. You'll know when it's at the bottom because it makes a different sound and you won't be able to hit any further. After we install the bearing with the press, we need to make sure we remember to put the lock washer and the lock nut on. Go ahead and put it in the vise so we can tighten it up. Just get it snug by hand, and then we'll finish the job with the hammer to line up the lock washer with the lock nut. Just find a tab that's close. So we'll choose that one there, and then we'll just tap it until it's lined up. We've got one of the slots lined up with the lock washer right here. So we're going to take our chisel right here and just tap it into place, and just until it's seated into the slot. You don't have to flatten it completely. It makes it a little more difficult to take it off, but just as long as it's not overhanging outside of the lock nut. All right, next we have an oil seal that goes above the needle bearing to keep the grease in. So be sure to pay attention to the orientation of this seal. We're going to use the same tool we used to put the needle bearing in to install this seal. Using this tool allows us to put even pressure on the seal and install it straight without getting it crooked. Clean out the slot for the retaining ring, and then the retaining ring goes next. And we'll put the retaining ring on using our retaining ring pliers. You can give the retaining ring just a light tap on the open end just to make sure it's fully seated. Okay. All right, now we're ready to move on to the separator shaft. All right, so we have our bearing assembly here, right side up. We're going to insert the rotor shaft into the bore. I've already checked to make sure the bore is clean and free of debris and smooth. You can feel it from the bottom to make sure it's starting to go straight. Now if you take your dead blow, it should go in with relative ease. Okay. You can notice the hammer pitch, the sound changes slightly when it's fully seated. We'll continue to seat it if necessary when we tighten the end cover. Before we go there though, we will install the separator shaft into the rotor shaft. And again, you can wiggle the other end of the shaft to get it started and straight. You see this one's going in a little easier. Just giving it a little pressure with my hand. All right, that's fully seated. Next we have a sleeve here. This goes right on top of that lock nut. And we'll use one of our sleeve installation tools to put this on. Okay, the next part would be to put the separator shaft end cover on. But before we install it, we need to put the seal in place that will be riding on that sleeve there. Okay, once again for this end cover and the seal installation, we're going to use our plastic ended hammer and just tap around the edge till you get it started. Okay, now that we have the seal and the end cover, we need to go ahead and install this onto the shaft. This gasket here gets installed in between the end cover and the end of the rotor shaft. We use 3 gaskets. You can get those holes aligned. And we use 4 socket head cap screws. Just make sure to go around and tighten each screw evenly to make sure that the end cover is going on straight. Okay, now that they're all snug, we'll just give them another slight turn, maybe just less than a quarter turn, make sure they're all snug. Now that we have the end cover on the rotor shaft installed, we need to install this end cover. In this instance, we're using 2 gaskets. Once we get this tightened, we're going to check to make sure we have a positive clamping effect on the bearings. So there should be a slight gap between the end cover and the bearing assembly, and also this end cover and the rotor shaft. That's just to make sure that the bearing doesn't move at all and that you get a nice tight fit. You might notice that right now this shaft seal actually is not riding on the rotor shaft, but when the rotor disc gets installed, there is a lip on the rotor disc that will mate with this seal, which that causes the sealing to be completed. So again, we'll just check all the bolts, make sure they're tight. Now I'll use my set of feeler gauges just to see if we do in fact have a positive clamping effect. Okay, you can see the feeler gauge fits in there, which is what you want to see. It means the end cover is engaging with the bearing and pressing on it. Okay, and we have the same thing here on the bearing housing in this end cover. We have a positive clamping effect. For the next few steps, we'll flip over the bearing housing and work from the other side to get the other end covers on. Okay, first we'll go ahead with this end cover on this face of the bearing assembly. And again, we have a gasket, so put that in place. Shaft seal goes on the shaft seal goes over the shaft. And here we have the same kind of bolts. Just make sure you have this installed in the right orientation. Helpful note is that the holes for the bolts are countersunk, so there really only is one way to install it. Once again, we're just going evenly, make sure that the end cover doesn't get hung up on any of those flanges. So our next step is to install this sleeve on the end of the separator shaft here. This goes right below the inner race of the needle bearing. The reason that we didn't install it until now is because that seal orientation makes it difficult to install the shaft when this is on. So if we put it on after, it will install, or it glides through the seal without risking losing the spring. So now that the sleeve is in place, we will go ahead and lock it in place with the final lock washer and lock nut for this assembly. Once the tab is in place, we'll just tap it forward. We'll just go ahead and tape the keys in place. Now if you're doing this in your shop, you don't have to do this step. You can just bring it right to the machine for the installation of the pulleys and the belts. So this is your separator shaft, this is where your pulley will go. And then this is where your pulley for your rotor shaft will go. The lower needle bearing, which is now on the top since we have this flipped upside down, is a greased bearing. So we need to install the grease port here. So you can just use your adjustable wrench to thread that into place. Okay, we flipped the assembly back over, and I'm just going to put the keys in place and tape them like I did on the other side, just so we don't lose them in transportation. And we also have a pipe plug to install here on the bearing housing itself. So we'll put that there and tighten it with your adjustable. Last thing is the lock washer and lock nut that would be used to hold the rotor in place. Now that that is installed, check for free rotation of the rotor shaft and the separator shaft. And once you have confirmed that, you're all set. And that's the assembly of the 30 ACM coaxial bearing assembly.